The wooden stairs creaked beneath Jake Thompson's sneakers as he darted down the dim hallway. He took them two at a time, excitement bubbling in his chest. The flickering bulb at the stairwell's base cast long, jittery shadows on the paneled walls. But Jake didn't care. He was on a mission. It was Friday night, his favorite part of the week. Homework was done, well, mostly done, and the Xbox waited in the basement, an oasis of neon lights and controller clicks. Jake could already picture himself racing his friends online, the thrill of the game drowning out the dull quiet of the suburban evening. "Jake, don't stay up too late," his mom, Sarah, called from the kitchen above. Her voice carried that motherly mix of care and mild exasperation. "Okay, Mom," he yelled back, not meaning it. The door to the basement groaned as he pushed it open. Cool air brushed past his face, carrying the faint, musty smell of old cardboard and forgotten junk. He loved the basement. It was his space, a retreat from the predictability of school, chores, and his dad's constant reminders to be responsible. Jake flipped the light switch. The single bulb in the middle of the ceiling came to life with a sluggish hum, illuminating the cluttered room below. Boxes stacked against the walls, an old treadmill draped in a blanket, and the glowing green logo of the Xbox beckoned him from the corner. He hopped down the final steps, sneakers hitting the concrete with a satisfying slap. He tossed his backpack onto an old chair, grabbed a controller, and settled into the beat-up beanbag chair that had been his throne for as long as he could remember. "Let's do this," Jake muttered to himself, the loading screen reflecting in his eager brown eyes. For now, everything was normal, just another night in a quiet house on a quiet street. But something was waiting in the dark corners of that basement, something Jake couldn't see, yet. Jake Thompson was, by all accounts, a normal 10-year-old kid. With his messy brown hair and an endless supply of energy, he was the kind of boy who could charm adults and drive them to exhaustion in equal measure. He lived for the little things, staying up late to play video games, sneaking an extra cookie when his mom wasn't looking, and racing his friends at recess. His mom, Sarah, often joked that Jake was a miniature tornado. A protective and caring woman, she juggled parenting with a part-time job at the local library, always keeping a watchful eye on Jake. "You're gonna break your neck running around like that," she'd say, shaking her head with a smile. Jake's dad, Mike, wasn't home as much as Jake would have liked. A corporate manager at a nearby tech company, Mike's life revolved around spreadsheets and late-night conference calls. Though he cared for his family, his work kept him distant, something Sarah tried her best to balance. The Thompsons lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind where people waved at each other from their driveways, but rarely struck up long conversations. Their home, a modest two-story with a red front door, had an odd charm. Jake loved it, especially the basement, which was his escape from the world upstairs. The basement wasn't particularly special. It was a little cluttered, like most basements, with stacks of old boxes and forgotten pieces of furniture. An old treadmill stood in one corner, its belt dusty and unused. The walls were lined with unfinished wooden panels that felt rough to the touch, and the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling left plenty of shadows to lurk in the edges of the room. But the Xbox setup, oh, that was where the magic happened. A small TV perched on a rickety stand, the console glowing faintly beside it, surrounded by a tangle of wires and Jake's collection of games. It was where he spent his evenings, battling friends online or exploring pixelated worlds with the kind of focus only kids could muster. And yet, as familiar as the basement was, it always had an air of something off. Maybe it was the way the light seemed weaker in certain corners, or how the air down there was always cooler than the rest of the house. Jake had never paid it much mind, until recently. Small things had started to catch his attention. A distant creak when no one was around. The faint smell of something damp, almost earthy, like old leaves after a rainstorm. He dismissed it as his imagination, the kind of tricks your brain plays when you're in a dimly lit room. Still, something about the basement felt alive in a way Jake couldn't explain. And as he settled into his beanbag chair that evening, gripping his controller, the shadows seemed to press just a little closer, watching him in silence. Jake's evenings followed a comfortable rhythm. School ended, dinner was a mix of whatever his mom managed to throw together, and then came the best part of the night, basement gaming. He'd sprint down the creaky wooden stairs, flip on the light, and dive straight into the pixelated adventures waiting for him. At first, nothing felt out of the ordinary. The hum of the Xbox booting up filled the room, the dim bulb cast its usual yellowish glow, and Jake immersed himself in his game. Hours slipped by in a blur of button mashing and online chatter with his friends. But then, small things began to tug at the edges of his attention. It started with the shadows. Jake first noticed it during a particularly intense match. Out of the corner of his eye, the shadows in the far corner of the room seemed to flicker. Not just from the TV's glow, but as if they shifted on their own. He turned his head quickly, expecting to see something there, but there was nothing. Just the treadmill draped in its dusty blanket and the usual mess of old boxes. "Probably just my eyes," Jake muttered, shaking it off. But the game suddenly felt less absorbing, the basement too quiet. Then came the noises, faint creaks and groans that seemed to come from beneath the floor. Jake tried to tell himself it was the house settling. It was an old place after all. But the sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic, like faint footsteps pacing just under the concrete. On the third night, something even stranger happened. Jake was mid-game, controller in hand, when he heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was so soft he wasn't sure if it was real or his imagination. He paused the game and strained to listen. "Hello," he called, his voice cracking slightly. Silence. The basement seemed to hold its breath, the light above flickering once before holding steady. Jake laughed nervously to himself and shook his head. "Get a grip, dude. You're freaking yourself out," he muttered, turning back to his game. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the unease lingered. Every time he raced upstairs for a snack, he caught himself glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting to see something creeping up behind him. He even started taking the stairs two at a time, his heart racing until he reached the safety of the hallway above. His parents didn't notice anything unusual. When he told his mom about the flickering light or the weird noises, she brushed it off with a dismissive, "It's just an old house, Jake. Things creak and groan all the time." His dad, distracted by work, barely looked up from his laptop. But Jake knew something was different. The basement wasn't just a space for video games anymore. It felt alive in a way that made his skin crawl. One night, as he packed up his game, he noticed something strange near the Xbox. A faint handprint smudged into the thin layer of dust on the old treadmill. Jake froze, his eyes locked on the mark. It was small, about the size of his own hand, and smeared as if it had been dragged across the surface. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached out and wiped it away with his sleeve, convincing himself it had always been there. But as he climbed the stairs that night, the distinct feeling of being watched followed him all the way up. The next evening, Jake's excitement to play his game was dulled by the lingering unease from the night before. The handprint on the treadmill, the whispers, the flickering light, they all stayed with him like a bad dream that refused to fade. But he pushed the thoughts aside as he made his way down to the basement. The door groaned open, and the familiar rush of cold air met him. This time it felt heavier, almost oppressive, as if the air itself was pressing against his skin. Jake hesitated at the top of the stairs, his hand tightening around the railing. "Just go," he whispered to himself, forcing his legs to move. The stairs creaked loudly under his sneakers, and with every step, the basement seemed to grow quieter, as if it were swallowing the sounds of the house above. He flipped on the light, and the single bulb sputtered before finally flickering to life. The shadows clung to the edges of the room like they didn't want to be disturbed. Jake settled into his beanbag chair, controller in hand, and stared at the screen. He felt a little better once the game started. The familiar sounds of explosions and cheering in his headset drowned out the oppressive silence of the basement. But that night, the basement had other plans. About an hour into the game, Jake decided to run upstairs for a snack. He paused the game, tossed his controller onto the beanbag, and jogged toward the stairs. That's when it happened. Halfway up the stairs, something grabbed his leg. The grip was sudden and firm, closing around his ankle like a vice. Jake let out a sharp yelp as his foot slipped off the step, and he fell forward, his chin smacking against the wooden step. His heart pounded wildly as he scrambled to his knees, twisting around to see what had grabbed him. His eyes darted frantically across the dimly lit staircase, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" His voice came out shaky and small. Silence. The air was thick, cold. Jake's breathing was shallow as he scanned the stairs below him. He half expected to see a hand retreating into the shadows or something lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing, only the empty steps and the faint glow of the Xbox in the room below. His ankle throbbed where he swore something had grabbed him. He reached down, rubbing the spot, but there were no marks. "Maybe I tripped," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. He had felt it, fingers, cold and unyielding. He bolted up the rest of the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind him. His mom glanced up from her book in the living room as he stumbled into the hallway. "Jake, what's wrong?" she asked, startled. "Nothing," he blurted out, his voice too loud. "I just tripped on the stairs." Sarah frowned. "Are you okay? Let me see." Jake quickly shook his head, pulling his leg back as if she might see something he didn't want to explain. "I'm fine, it's nothing. Just going to bed." He rushed past her, ignoring the concerned look she gave him. Upstairs, in the safety of his room, Jake sat on his bed, staring at his ankle. His skin was unmarked, but the sensation of that cold grip lingered. For the first time, he was afraid to go back down to the basement. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed were a blur of unease. Jake tried to avoid the basement as much as possible, but it loomed in his thoughts like a dark cloud. The memory of that cold, unyielding grip haunted him, replaying in his mind every time he climbed the stairs or passed the basement door. His mom, Sarah, noticed his reluctance to go downstairs. "You haven't been playing your games lately," she remarked one evening as they sat at the dinner table. Jake shrugged, poking at his mashed potatoes. "Just not feeling it," he muttered, keeping his eyes on his plate. Mike, his dad, glanced up from his phone and raised an eyebrow. "You're not getting bored of your Xbox, are you? That thing wasn't cheap." "I'm not bored," Jake snapped, louder than he intended. Both parents looked at him, surprised by his tone. "Sorry," he mumbled, his face turning red. That night, as the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Jake lay awake in bed, staring at the faint glow of his nightlight. The basement felt like a living thing, a malevolent presence waiting for him to return. But Jake wasn't just scared, he was curious. He wanted to know what was down there. What had grabbed his leg? Why was the basement suddenly so different, so alive? The next afternoon, while his mom was at work and his dad buried in a conference call, Jake decided to investigate. He stood at the top of the basement stairs, his hands trembling as he gripped a flashlight. The overhead light didn't reach far into the shadows, and he wasn't taking any chances. "Okay," he whispered to himself. "Just go down, look around, and get out." The stairs groaned beneath his weight as he descended, every step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the bottom, he swept the flashlight across the room, its beam cutting through the dimness. The basement was just as cluttered as always. Boxes, the old treadmill, his beanbag chair. But something felt different. Jake's eyes were drawn to the far corner of the room where a stack of dusty boxes sat beneath a forgotten tarp. The air seemed colder there, heavier. He approached cautiously, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He pulled the tarp aside and froze. Beneath it was an old box of childhood memorabilia, school yearbooks, crayon drawings, and a few faded photographs. But what caught his attention was an object buried at the bottom of the box, a dusty, battered Xbox controller. Jake picked it up, his heart pounding. It looked ancient, almost identical to the one he used now, but the buttons were worn, the plastic faded. Something about it sent a chill down his spine. Next to the controller was a photograph, yellowed with age. Jake held it up to the flashlight and squinted at the image. It was a family portrait, taken in the same house. There was a younger version of his dad, his grandparents, and, Jake's breath caught, a boy who looked eerily like him. He flipped the photo over and saw something scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Matthew 1987, gone too soon." Jake's mind raced. He'd never heard of Matthew before, but the resemblance was uncanny. Who was he? Why was his picture hidden here? The air around him seemed to grow colder, pressing against his skin like icy fingers. A faint creak sounded behind him, and Jake whipped around, the flashlight beam darting wildly across the room. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The basement was silent, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Jake dropped the photo and the controller, his hands shaking as he bolted up the stairs, his flashlight clattering against the steps as he fled. When he reached the safety of the hallway, he slammed the door shut and leaned against it, his chest heaving. He wasn't just scared now, he was sure of it. Something was in the basement, and somehow it was connected to Matthew. Jake knew he couldn't avoid the basement forever. The house seemed to hum with a quiet tension, the kind that settled in your bones and refused to leave. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the wind against the windows, it all felt amplified, like the house itself was watching him. For 2 days, Jake stayed as far from the basement as possible, but the pull of the mystery gnawed at him. The name on the photograph, the old controller, the uncanny resemblance to the boy named Matthew, they swirled in his mind like a storm. He had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. That night, when the house was dark and his parents were asleep, Jake grabbed his flashlight and crept down the stairs. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached the basement door. He hesitated, hand hovering over the knob before slowly turning it. The door opened with its usual groan, and the basement yawned below him, dark and waiting. He flipped the light switch, but this time the bulb flickered twice and went out completely. Jake swallowed hard and clicked on his flashlight. The narrow beam pierced the darkness, but it did little to calm his nerves. He descended the stairs slowly, each creak of the wood beneath him making his skin crawl. When he reached the bottom, the air was colder than he remembered, almost icy. The flashlight's beam trembled as he swept it across the room, the shadows seeming to ripple and shift at the edges of the light. "Okay," he whispered to himself, gripping the flashlight tightly. "Just talk. Maybe it wants to talk." His voice sounded absurdly small in the vast silence of the basement, but he forced himself to keep going. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaking. "What do you want?" For a moment, there was nothing. Just the soft hum of the flashlight and the distant ticking of the house above. Then a faint noise like a whisper but deeper, more guttural, rose from the darkness. Jake's heart felt like it might burst as he spun the flashlight toward the sound. The beam landed on the old Xbox setup, and for a moment he thought he saw something move in the corner of his vision. The air grew colder still, and the whispering grew louder, though the words were impossible to make out. Jake felt rooted to the spot, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then, with a sudden burst of static, the Xbox turned on by itself. The green logo flared to life on the screen, casting an eerie glow over the room. The controller on the beanbag chair twitched, as if pulled by an unseen hand, and fell to the floor with a sharp clatter. Jake's flashlight flickered, and for a split second he saw something. A shape, faint and translucent, standing near the TV. It was a boy, about his age, with hollow eyes and a face twisted in anguish. Jake froze, his throat too tight to scream. The figure reached out, its hand ghostly and pale, pointing toward the old photo and controller Jake had discovered earlier. "Matthew," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped closer, the air around it growing colder with each movement. Jake could feel his legs trembling, but he didn't run, he couldn't. "What do you want?" he asked again, louder this time. The figure stopped, its face contorting as if in pain. Then, in a voice that sounded like the crackle of distant static, it whispered, "Help me." Jake's flashlight flickered and went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. The Xbox screen flashed, and the room was filled with images. An old living room, the same house decades ago, a boy sitting on the floor with a controller in his hand. The boy was laughing, but then the images changed. The laughter stopped. Jake watched in horror as the boy on the screen, Matthew, seemed to hear something behind him. He turned, his face frozen in fear, and then the screen went black. The whispers rose again, louder and more frantic, filling Jake's ears like a cacophony of voices. He dropped to his knees, covering his ears and shouting, "Stop! Stop it!" And then, as suddenly as it began, the noise ceased. The room was silent, the Xbox turned off, the screen going dark. Jake opened his eyes, his chest heaving. The ghostly figure was gone, but the feeling of its presence lingered. On the floor beside him was the old controller and the photograph, now resting side by side. Jake reached out with trembling hands and picked them up. "I'll help you," he whispered, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at him. "I promise." The air seemed to shift, warming slightly, and for the first time in days, Jake felt a small glimmer of hope. But he also knew that the real challenge was still ahead. The next day, Jake could barely focus at school. His thoughts swirled around the events of the night before. The apparition, the whispered plea, the images on the Xbox screen. Who was Matthew and what had happened to him? More importantly, how could Jake help him? That evening after dinner, Jake decided to confront his parents. He waited until his dad had closed his laptop and his mom was folding laundry in the living room. "Can I ask you guys something?" Jake began, his voice unsteady. Sarah glanced up, concerned by his tone. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" Jake hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Who's Matthew?" The question hung in the air like a dropped plate. His dad froze, his expression darkening, while his mom's face shifted to something between surprise and discomfort. "Where did you hear that name?" Mike asked, his voice unusually sharp. Jake swallowed hard. "I found an old photo in the basement. It had his name on it. He looks like me." Sarah sighed, setting the laundry aside. "Matthew was your dad's older brother," she said softly. He disappeared when he was about your age. It was a long time ago." Mike looked away, his jaw tightening. Jake could tell this was a subject his dad didn't want to discuss, but he pressed on. "What happened to him?" "No one knows," Sarah answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was playing in the basement one evening, and he never came back upstairs. The police searched everywhere, but there was no trace of him." Jake's dad stood abruptly, his face pale. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Matthew's gone, and there's no point dredging up the past." With that, he left the room, leaving Jake and his mom in uneasy silence. That night, Jake returned to the basement, determined to keep his promise. Armed with the photograph and the old controller, he sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor. The basement was eerily quiet, but Jake felt a strange sense of purpose. He held the photograph up, staring at Matthew's face. "I'm here," he said aloud, his voice steady. "I know what happened to you. I know you're still here. Just tell me how to help." At first, nothing happened. Then the room grew cold and the faint sound of static filled the air. Jake's flashlight flickered and the Xbox turned on by itself, the green logo glowing brighter than ever. The controller in Jake's lap trembled, then lifted into the air as if guided by unseen hands. The photograph too floated upward, its edges curling as if caught in a breeze. "Help me," the voice whispered again, louder this time. Jake clenched his fists, his fear replaced by determination. "I will," he said, "but you have to tell me what to do." The photograph began to glow faintly, the image of Matthew and the family becoming sharper, more vivid. The boy in the picture turned his head slightly, as if looking directly at Jake. "Find it," the voice said, clearer now, almost pleading. "Find what?" Jake asked, his breath quickening. The Xbox screen flickered, and an image appeared. A small metal box, old and rusted, hidden beneath a pile of rubble. Jake recognized the corner of the basement where the image was focused. It was where the old treadmill now stood. He scrambled to his feet and rushed to the spot, shoving the treadmill aside with all his strength. Beneath it, half buried under dust and debris, was the box from the screen. Jake knelt and pried it open. Inside, he found a tattered notebook and a few other small items, a toy car, a key, and a folded piece of paper. The notebook's pages were filled with scribbled writing, frantic and disjointed. Jake flipped through it, his heart sinking as he realized it was Matthew's. The last entry sent a chill down his spine. "It's in the dark. It doesn't want me to leave. I can't escape." The folded paper was a letter addressed to Jake's dad. Matthew's handwriting was shaky but legible. "Mike, if you ever find this, I'm sorry, I tried to be brave. I hope you can forgive me." Tears pricked Jake's eyes as he clutched the note. "You don't have to stay here anymore," he said aloud, his voice breaking. "I found it. I know what happened." The air around him shifted, warmer now, and the faint outline of Matthew appeared once more. The boy's expression was softer, almost peaceful. "Thank you," Matthew's voice echoed faintly. The Xbox turned off with a quiet click, and the room grew still. Jake sat there for a short time holding the note. The basement didn't feel cold or oppressive anymore. It felt quiet. For the first time in days, Jake climbed the stairs without looking over his shoulder. He slept soundly that night, the weight of the mystery lifted from his chest. But deep down, he knew the echoes of the past would always remain. In the days that followed, Jake couldn't stop thinking about the basement. It wasn't fear anymore, but a strange mix of sadness and curiosity. He had done what Matthew asked. He had helped. But the questions that remained haunted him. What had really happened to Matthew that night? Was it the house, the basement, or something else entirely. Jake told his mom about the old box and showed her the notebook and letter. She listened with a somber expression, her fingers brushing over the faded handwriting. "Your dad might need some time before he can talk about this," she said softly. It was always so hard for him to let go. That night, Jake sat in the living room, the photo of Matthew propped on the coffee table in front of him. The house felt lighter, as if a heavy weight had been lifted. Even the basement didn't feel as oppressive when Jake passed the door. Still, there were little things Jake couldn't ignore. The faintest whisper of static when he walked past the TV, the cold, fleeting chill that sometimes brushed against his skin, the way the controller on the Xbox setup would occasionally shift, just a little, as if someone unseen had touched it. One Friday evening, Jake decided to play Xbox again. The basement felt different now, less threatening, but not entirely normal. He turned on the console, sinking into the familiar comfort of his beanbag chair. For the first hour, it was as if everything had gone back to how it used to be. But as Jake finished a race in his favorite game, the screen flickered. The image glitched for a moment, and Jake froze, his hands gripping the controller tightly. The static faded, and a message appeared on the screen. Just 3 words. "Thank you, Jake." His heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, the familiar weight of unease settling over him again. But this time, it didn't feel cold or menacing. It felt grateful. Jake whispered, "You're welcome," before the message blinked out, replaced by the game's usual loading screen. He powered down the console and sat in the dim light of the basement for a moment longer, listening to the hum of the house around him. Everything was quiet now, peaceful. As he climbed the stairs, he glanced back one last time. The basement seemed ordinary again, just a messy room filled with forgotten things. But in the corner where the treadmill had once been, the shadows were just a little darker, a little deeper. "I saw them." Jake didn't stay to look. He shut the door behind him and locked it, a small smile playing on his lips. But as he turned away, he thought he heard the faintest sound, a soft creak, like a single footstep on the stairs. And he couldn't help but wonder if Matthew had truly moved on, or if some part of him still lingered, waiting for someone else to listen.